Chapter 1. The Evening Commute. As the sun dipped below the city skyline, casting a golden glow over the bustling streets, Judge Marcus Williams settled into his car, hoping for a quiet drive home. His day in court had been long, filled with tense arguments and weighty decisions, yet he remained calm and composed, as always. His suit was perfectly pressed, his demeanor dignified, a man respected and revered by those who knew his name. But tonight, he was just another man on the road, blending into the evening rush hour. Marcus turned up the jazz on his radio, letting the smooth notes drift over him as he thought of his family waiting at home, a rare smile crossing his face. At the next light, a police cruiser pulled up a few cars behind him, lights flashing briefly as it slowed to a stop. Marcus noticed, but didn't give it much thought. After all, he'd done nothing wrong. He was simply another driver in a sea of commuters. But that fleeting moment of relaxation shattered when he glanced in his rearview mirror. The officer was staring directly at him, eyes narrowed with suspicion, even hostility. The light turned green, and Marcus continued driving, keeping a calm hand on the wheel. But as he merged into the next lane, the police cruiser slid in behind him, the lights now flashing red and blue in his rearview mirror. As the siren blared, Marcus felt a chill run through him, knowing too well how easily an innocent moment could turn dangerous. Yet, he pulled over calmly, bracing himself for an unexpected encounter that somehow felt heavier than any case he'd presided over in court. Chapter 2. Suspicion on Patrol. Officer Dan Murphy was on his regular evening patrol, scanning the city streets with an almost restless intensity. Fresh out of the academy and eager to make his mark, he approached each shift with a firm mindset. Keep the streets safe, no matter the cost. But tonight, that mindset would be put to the test in ways he didn't anticipate. As he drove through the city's bustling downtown, something caught his eye. A sleek, black car idling at a red light up ahead. It was nothing out of the ordinary, really, just a well-kept vehicle blending into the lineup of commuters. Yet, for some reason, it held his attention. Maybe it was the driver's calm demeanor or his seemingly confident posture. Maybe it was just intuition. Whatever it was, Officer Murphy felt a spark of suspicion he couldn't shake. As the light turned green and the car began to pull away, Murphy's grip on the wheel tightened. He was alert, focused, and curious. Without realizing it, his mind was already making judgments. An expensive car, a man who didn't fit the image he expected. Something felt off, or so he convinced himself.
Could be nothing,
he muttered, eyes narrowing.
But better safe than sorry.
In a quick decision, Murphy flicked on his lights, weaving through traffic to follow the car as it turned down a quieter side street. The driver, seeming calm and composed, didn't speed up or show any sign of concern, which only made Murphy's suspicions grow. In his experience, anyone who acted that cool and collected either had something to hide or was far too confident for his liking. The red and blue lights flashed in his reflection as Murphy signaled for the driver to pull over. His heart was beating a little faster, though he wouldn't admit it. This was his moment, an opportunity to catch someone in the wrong, to prove he was sharp, that he could detect a threat, even in the mundane routine of a city street. As the car came to a stop, Murphy's gaze sharpened. He didn't know who he was dealing with, but he was already preparing himself to assert his authority, ready to uncover whatever secrets this man might be hiding. Murphy stepped out of his cruiser, hand hovering near his holster, approaching the car with a hardened stare, his mind clouded by assumptions that would soon be shattered. Marcus took a deep breath, steadying himself as he watched the flashing lights in his rearview mirror. He'd been through enough in life to know not to jump to conclusions. Maybe it was just a routine stop, he told himself. Still, as he pulled over to the side, a feeling of unease settled in the pit of his stomach. Something about this didn't feel right. Chapter 3. The Pullover. A moment later, Officer Dan Murphy stepped out of his cruiser, his face set in a stern, almost challenging expression. Murphy had been with the force for a little over a year, but he carried himself with an intensity that came from a desire to prove himself. The night shift often brought a mix of the mundane and the unexpected, and to Murphy, this car had an aura of mystery he couldn't ignore. It was a quick judgment, but he had made it. Something about this man didn't sit well with him. Murphy's eyes scanned Marcus's car, his gaze lingering a little too long, a little too critically. In his mind, he was already building a story. This man didn't belong in this car, on this street, in this part of town. A quiet confidence radiated from Marcus, which only fueled Murphy's assumptions. Experience had taught Marcus to remain calm in tense situations, but the young officer seemed to interpret his composure as arrogance.
License and registration.
Murphy ordered sharply as he approached the driver's side window. Marcus handed over his documents without a word, his face a mask of calm. Yet, the flicker of irritation in Murphy's eyes didn't go unnoticed. The officer examined the documents carefully, as if searching for a hidden clue, something to confirm his suspicions.
You from around here?
Murphy asked, his tone cold, almost accusing.
Yes, officer.
Marcus replied evenly, holding the officer's gaze with a calm that seemed to unsettle him further. Murphy frowned, feeling the weight of Marcus's steady gaze, as though the man in the driver's seat knew something he didn't. The silence between them grew thick, each moment stretching into the next. For Marcus, it was just another evening. For Murphy, it was a chance to prove something to himself, though he couldn't yet see that he was on the edge of a lesson that would soon challenge everything he thought he knew. As Marcus sat in his car, waiting for Officer Murphy to return with his documents, he could feel the weight of the officer's suspicion hanging in the air. His calm demeanor hadn't seemed to ease the officer's tension. If anything, it had only added fuel to whatever assumptions Murphy was making. Marcus had experienced interactions like this before, but tonight felt particularly tense. The silence felt oppressive, filled with unspoken words and judgments. But Marcus knew better than to let it show. He kept his expression steady, his gaze forward. Meanwhile, Officer Murphy was studying Marcus's license and registration, glancing back at the car every few seconds. Something about this whole scenario nagged at him. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but the confidence in Marcus's manner seemed almost defiant. Murphy was used to people squirming, explaining themselves, or, at the very least, showing a hint of nervousness. But this man? This man acted like he had nothing to fear, and for some reason, that rubbed Murphy the wrong way. Murphy walked back to the car, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. He stopped by the driver's side window, leaning in just a bit too close.
You seem awfully calm for someone who just got pulled over,
Murphy remarked, his tone laced with suspicion. Marcus looked up at him, unfazed.
Is there a reason I shouldn't be calm, officer?
Murphy's eyes narrowed. There was something about the way Marcus held himself that felt like a challenge. The officer took a step back, crossing his arms and studying Marcus as if he were trying to solve a puzzle.
So what's your business around here?
Murphy asked, his tone probing, as though Marcus's presence alone was cause for suspicion. Marcus took a breath, his patience beginning to wear thin, but he kept his voice steady.
I live here, officer. I was just on my way home.
Murphy didn't seem convinced. He glanced around as if searching for evidence of wrongdoing in the empty street.
You live here.
He echoed, his voice tinged with disbelief.
And where exactly is home for you?
Not far from here.
Marcus replied calmly, his eyes meeting Murphy's with a quiet strength.
I'm sure it's all there on the address on my license.
Murphy felt a flash of irritation, his control slipping for just a second. But something in Marcus's gaze made him hesitate, a nagging feeling that maybe this wasn't going to be the routine stop he'd expected. Yet he pushed that thought aside, his mind set on uncovering whatever truth he believed lay hidden just beneath the surface. Chapter 4. an unequal exchange. The air between Marcus and Officer Murphy was thick with tension as they stood face to face in the dim glow of the streetlights. To anyone passing by, it might have looked like a simple routine traffic stop, but both men knew there was more beneath the surface. Marcus's steady composure seemed to needle at Murphy, who couldn't shake the feeling that this man was somehow challenging him, even if only by refusing to act intimidated. Murphy cleared his throat, his gaze shifting from Marcus to the car, then back to Marcus. He leaned in, trying to assert his authority, and asked in a clipped tone,
What kind of work do you do, exactly?
Marcus met his gaze evenly.
I work in the legal field.
He replied calmly, choosing his words carefully.
The legal field, huh?
Murphy scoffed, clearly unimpressed.
So what are you, a lawyer?
There was a hint of disdain in his voice, as if he couldn't fathom the idea of someone like Marcus being successful in such a profession. Marcus's lips tightened just slightly, though his expression remained calm.
You could say that.
He replied, not volunteering any more information than necessary. Experience had taught him that sometimes it was best to let assumptions play themselves out. Murphy smirked, clearly not satisfied with the answer.
Funny, because you don't look like any lawyer I've met,
he said, his tone dripping with condescension.
Where'd you get that car anyway?
Marcus took a slow breath, reminding himself to remain composed.
I worked hard for it,
he replied simply. Murphy's eyes narrowed. He didn't like Marcus's calm responses, as if this man thought he was above the situation.
You know, people like you ought to remember their place. Just because you drive a nice car doesn't mean you're fooling anyone.
Marcus felt a flicker of anger rise, but kept his expression neutral.
And what place would that be, officer?
He asked, his voice calm, but with an unmistakable edge. Murphy stepped back, crossing his arms, as he gave Marcus a dismissive once-over.
Let's just say some people need to be reminded they don't own the world,
he muttered, barely audible but pointed enough to sting. As Marcus looked back at him, he saw not just a man in a uniform, but someone trapped in his own prejudices. And in that moment, Marcus knew that this was no longer just a traffic stop. It was a battle of values, a clash of respect and arrogance, and an unequal exchange that was about to come to a head. Chapter 5. The confrontation intensifies. Officer Murphy's patience was wearing thin. Despite his repeated attempts to intimidate Marcus, the man remained calm, unwavering. It was as if nothing Murphy could say or do would shake him, and that only added fuel to the fire. In Murphy's eyes, this wasn't just a routine stop anymore. It was a test of his authority, one he was determined not to lose. He took a step closer to Marcus, his voice dropping to a near whisper, loaded with veiled aggression.
I don't know who you think you are, but I'm not here to play games. So, unless you have a reason for being out here, I'd suggest you stop with the attitude.
Marcus held Murphy's gaze, his expression steady, though his patience was beginning to fray.
Officer, I've given you everything you asked for. License, registration. I've been respectful. Now, I'm asking you to extend the same courtesy.
Murphy's face tightened. He wasn't used to being spoken to this way, especially by someone he had already written off as trouble.
Courtesy? I don't think you're in any position to demand anything. You may think you're clever, but you're just another guy on the street to me.
The words stung, but Marcus refused to let it show. He took a deep breath, choosing his response carefully.
With all due respect, officer, I believe we're all just people on the street. We all deserve basic decency.
But Murphy wasn't listening. His hands clenched, and for a moment, he considered taking things further, maybe even searching the car just to make a point. He stepped closer, his voice low, but filled with thinly veiled threat.
You think just because you've got a nice suit and a fancy car, You're better than me.
Marcus's expression didn't change, but his voice took on a firmer edge.
No, officer. I'm simply asking for the respect any citizen should receive.
The quiet confidence in Marcus's voice unsettled Murphy. It was as though this man was seeing right through him, past his badge, his authority, and into the insecurities he tried to mask with bravado. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He was the one in control, yet here he was, feeling as though he were on trial. And in that tense silence, with his authority being challenged in the gentlest yet firmest way possible, Murphy sensed a shift. He could feel his grip on the situation slipping, though he would never admit it. This wasn't the typical encounter he expected, and somehow that realization left him unnerved in a way he couldn't quite explain. Chapter 6. A Quiet Strength. As Officer Murphy continued to glare, Marcus remained calm, his expression a blend of patience and quiet resilience. In all his years on the bench, he had faced far more intense situations. Lawyers arguing, defendants pleading, witnesses breaking down under pressure. He knew how to stay composed in the face of aggression. But tonight, it wasn't just about staying calm. It was about standing his ground in a way that spoke volumes without raising his voice. Murphy, on the other hand, was beginning to unravel. The silence between them was deafening, thick with tension. He expected Marcus to stammer, to explain himself, maybe even to beg. But instead, Marcus simply stood there, as steady as a mountain, refusing to bend. The officer's attempts to shake him had failed, and that quiet strength was eating away at Murphy's confidence.
Is there something you need from me, officer?
Marcus asked, his voice calm and measured, with a subtle hint of challenge. There was no aggression, only a firmness that suggested he was not to be intimidated. Murphy opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. For the first time, he felt as though the tables had turned, as if this man was no longer simply a driver he had pulled over. Marcus's calm gaze seemed to strip away the layers of Murphy's authority, exposing the officer's insecurities and assumptions. Suddenly, Murphy felt smaller, as if he were the one being questioned. Marcus didn't move, didn't falter. His silence spoke louder than any words could. He didn't need to raise his voice or assert his power. His presence alone conveyed his strength. It was a strength that came from years of experience, from standing up for justice, and from a deep-seated belief in treating others with respect, something Murphy was beginning to realize he had forgotten in his eagerness to assert control. Murphy's bravado began to crack. His gaze shifted, his voice slightly softer as he muttered,
Just stay right here. I'll be back.
He turned and walked toward his cruiser, the weight of the encounter pressing down on him like a stone. For all his authority, he felt suddenly vulnerable, as if he were the one being judged. And as Murphy walked away, Marcus allowed himself a small, inward sigh. He knew this was far from over, but in that moment, he recognized the power of his own quiet strength, a strength that could withstand the storm of prejudice without breaking, a strength that had kept him steady all his life. Chapter 7. The Officer's Revelation. Back in his cruiser, Officer Murphy gripped the steering wheel, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had somehow lost control of the situation. This man, whoever he was different. His confidence wasn't the kind born of arrogance or defiance. It was quiet, unyielding, and it left Murphy feeling unsettled, even exposed. Trying to regain his composure, Murphy opened his onboard computer and typed in Marcus's license information. Within seconds, his screen filled with details that made his stomach drop. There, displayed in official text, was the name Judge Marcus Williams. Not just any judge, a federal judge with decades of service, known for his fairness and integrity. Murphy's face went pale. A federal judge? He just spent the last 20 minutes trying to intimidate a man who was a respected figure in the justice system. The realization hit him like a punch, and his bravado crumbled in an instant. Every harsh word, every suspicious glance, every assumption he'd made about Marcus rushed back to him, filling him with a sickening mix of regret and shame. He glanced back at Marcus's car, the man sitting patiently, dignified and composed. Murphy felt a knot tighten in his chest. How many times had he done this without thinking? How many times had he let his assumptions, his biases, cloud his judgment? And how many people hadn't been able to stand up to him with the quiet resilience that Marcus had shown? Swallowing hard, Murphy felt his grip on the wheel tighten. This wasn't just a simple mistake. This was a moment that would haunt him. He had assumed, judged, and treated a man unfairly based on nothing more than his own prejudices. And now, he had to face the reality of that mistake. Murphy knew he couldn't just walk back over as if nothing had happened. The weight of his actions was bearing down on him, and he felt his confidence drain away, replaced by a deep, uncomfortable awareness of his own shortcomings. For the first time, he saw himself not as an authority figure, but as a man who had fallen short of the very values he was sworn to uphold. Taking a deep breath, Murphy glanced back at the screen, then at Marcus's car. He wasn't just about to apologize to a federal judge. He was about to apologize to a man he had deeply wronged. And as he gathered himself, Murphy felt the full weight of a lesson he hadn't known he needed, a revelation that would stay with him long after this encounter. Chapter 8. The Judge's Lesson. Murphy took a deep breath, his heart pounding as he stepped out of his cruiser and walked back to Marcus's car. This time, there was no swagger, no hint of the overconfidence that had filled him just moments ago. Now, his steps were slower, his expression softened with a humility that hadn't been there before. The weight of what he had learned sat heavily on his shoulders, and he knew he had a difficult conversation ahead. As he reached the driver's side window, Marcus looked up, his expression calm and steady as ever. There was no anger in his eyes, only a quiet patience that had been there from the start. Murphy cleared his throat, his voice shaky as he began to speak.
Judge Williams, I had no idea.
Murphy stammered, his face flushing.
I didn't mean to, I'm sorry. I should have treated you with more respect.
Marcus took a moment before responding, studying the officer with a gaze that held both wisdom and understanding. He knew this wasn't just about him as a judge. It was about something larger, something deeper that Murphy needed to grasp.
Respect shouldn't be given based on someone's title, Officer Murphy.
Marcus said softly, his tone gentle but firm.
It should be given to everyone, regardless of who they are or where they come from.
Murphy swallowed, the truth of Marcus's words settling heavily on him. It was a simple statement, but it held a profound lesson, one that cut through his assumptions and reminded him of the values he was supposed to uphold. Marcus continued, his voice steady.
You're in a position of power, officer, and with that power comes the responsibility to treat people fairly, to give them the benefit of the doubt. When you don't, you risk not only their trust, but the trust of the community you serve.
Murphy nodded, his gaze dropping in shame. He hadn't realized just how deeply his biases had shaped his actions until now, standing before a man who embodied the principles he had strayed from.
I'll do better, Judge. I won't forget this.
Marcus offered a small nod, a look of compassion in his eyes.
We're all capable of growth, Officer Murphy. The important thing is that we learn from our mistakes and move forward with integrity.
And with that, Marcus's words settled like a weight lifted, a quiet but powerful lesson that Murphy would carry with him long after this night. Chapter 9. A Moment of Reflection. As Officer Murphy walked back to his cruiser, he felt an unfamiliar stillness settle over him. The sounds of the city faded into the background as he replayed the conversation with Judge Williams in his mind. Each word, each gentle reminder about respect and responsibility, echoed with a clarity he couldn't shake. This wasn't just an interaction. It was a mirror held up to his own assumptions, his own actions, forcing him to confront parts of himself he had ignored for too long. Sitting in his cruiser, Murphy glanced into the rearview mirror, catching his own reflection. The man staring back looked the same, yet somehow different, marked by the weight of realization. He had always prided himself on his duty, on keeping the streets safe, but tonight, he began to understand that safety wasn't just about authority or control. It was about building trust, about ensuring that people felt protected, not targeted. He thought back to the way he had approached Judge Williams from the start, how quickly he had made judgments based on nothing more than appearance, on biases he barely recognized, how easily he had slipped into a role of power, forgetting the respect and fairness he owed to every person he encountered. Murphy exhaled deeply, feeling the sting of shame, but also the spark of something else, determination. He realized he didn't want to be the kind of officer who acted on prejudice, who let his assumptions cloud his judgment. He wanted to be better, to live up to the values he had sworn to uphold when he first put on the uniform. He looked out of the cruiser window, watching as Judge Williams pulled away, driving into the night with the same calm dignity he had shown throughout the entire ordeal. Murphy felt a surge of respect for the man, not because of his title, but because of the quiet strength and integrity he had displayed in the face of unfair treatment. It was a strength that left a lasting impression, a reminder of the kind of person Murphy aspired to become. As he sat there, Murphy made a silent promise to himself. From this day forward, he would approach each person, each situation, with an open mind and a commitment to fairness. He wouldn't let assumptions define his actions. He would strive to be the officer Judge Williams believed he could be, the kind of officer who used his power responsibly, who treated every citizen with the respect they deserved. Tonight had been a turning point, a moment of reflection that would guide him on a path toward becoming not just a better officer, but a better man. Chapter 10. Respect Redefined. As Officer Murphy sat in his cruiser, the events of the night continued to sink in. It was remarkable, he thought, how much had changed in such a short time. A simple traffic stop had evolved into a lesson he hadn't known he needed, a lesson that redefined his understanding of respect, authority, and fairness. Tonight, Judge Williams hadn't simply corrected his behavior. He had planted a seed of transformation, one that Murphy knew would shape the rest of his career. With newfound clarity, Murphy realized that respect wasn't just something to be demanded because of a badge or uniform. True respect was a two-way street, something that should be extended to everyone, regardless of title, appearance, or circumstance. For too long, he had allowed assumptions and biases to cloud his interactions, to dictate his behavior. But now, he understood that every person he encountered was worthy of dignity and fairness. Judge Williams's words echoed in his mind. We're all capable of growth. The important thing is that we learn from our mistakes and move forward with integrity. Those words held a truth that transcended this single encounter. They spoke to the very essence of being human. Murphy realized that learning from one's mistakes was what allowed people to grow and evolve, both as individuals and as members of a community. As he pulled away from the curb, Murphy felt different. The authority he carried as an officer hadn't changed, but his approach to it had. He no longer saw himself as someone who simply enforced the law. He now viewed himself as a steward of justice, someone whose actions could build trust and respect rather than fear and resentment. It was a shift that brought a quiet resolve within him, a commitment to live up to the responsibility his badge represented. Driving through the city streets, Murphy thought of the people he would encounter in the future, the countless individuals with stories he couldn't possibly know, each deserving of the benefit of the doubt. He promised himself that he would remember this night, that he would carry forward the lesson Judge Williams had given him. And somewhere in the city, Judge Williams was likely driving home, unaware of just how profound an impact he had made. For him, it was perhaps just another reminder of the importance of integrity. But for Murphy, it was a life-altering moment, one that redefined what it meant to be a man of respect, duty, and honor.